Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Today, I'm sharing the fourth installment of my book talks with Emily Plank, author of Discovering the Culture of Childhood. It's the read-along selection this year for Not Just Cute readers. And that means that instead of one overview discussion, I've been having several in-depth chats with Emily. You can get caught up with those previous episodes by going to the podcast homepage at notjustcute.com/podcast or by searching them on iTunes or Stitcher. I've enjoyed all of our discussions, but I have to say that this one is my favorite. I know that sounds cliche, but honestly, this one is really, really good. In this episode, we discussed chapters 5 and 6, which address the topics of art and economics in the culture of childhood. Emily says that parts of these chapters really stretched her more than the others, but what came of that is really, really fascinating in my opinion. She's tackling tough concepts like whether adults commit a form of cultural appropriation when we approach art with kids, as well as how belonging, attachment, separation, and security all fit into the economics of childhood, and how we can make sure that our kids are rich in all the right ways. As always, Emily invites us to put on a new pair of spectacles and see childhood in a unique way. And what she helps us discover on our journey is truly fascinating. If you've been following our read-along, be sure to submit questions for my final discussion with Emily by clicking on the contact button in the header of my blog, notjustcute.com. You can also find the show notes for this episode at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 12. So now, let's get started.
Well, I'm so excited. For those who haven't been following along, first of all, you should go back to the other editions of this read-along in the podcast. We're talking about Emily Plank's book, Discovering the Culture of Childhood. And I love this perspective that you bring to it, Emily, of looking at childhood from the perspective of an explorer, of a scientist, looking at the culture that our children live in. And so I love that particularly. Today we're talking about chapters 5 and 6. And when you start chapter 5, which is about artistic expression, I love that perspective of looking at the art of a culture. And you start that whole chapter talking, kind of comparing us to an archaeologist in King Tut's tomb and the way that we examine a child's environment for the indicator of what's valued. And I just love that, the connection between the two. Like you walk into a tomb and it's just hollowed ground and you're taking it in like a scene from Indiana Jones is what I was picturing. And that we can look at a child's environment in the same way and see the clues that tell us what is valued in that culture and what's important. Do you want to expound a little bit on that imagery and that comparison?
Yeah, well, when I started thinking about artistic expression and I started to study the way anthropologists understand artistic expression among different cultures, the way that scientists have to kind of piece together ancient cultures that don't exist anymore, is often by looking at the art that they created and trying to understand, okay, what would this have been used for? How would this culture have, why was this object beautiful in this culture? And I started to wonder, okay, what if somebody were to, in thousands of years, were to unearth one of our modern day early childhood classrooms. If for some reason it was frozen in time exactly the way it is and it were to be unearthed in 2,000 years and an anthropologist were to try to understand the culture of childhood by exploring this space, I thought they would get a really interesting understanding of what childhood is. They would think, oh, the children in this culture really liked, in some early childhood environments, the children in this culture really liked creating all of the same projects. Look at this. They all wanted to create the same ladybug, paper bag pumpkin, egg carton caterpillar. They all wanted to create the same thing, or they were really fascinated with bright colors, or they really liked things hanging from the ceiling. I started to think about the images that I've seen from early childhood classrooms about what is best in preschools and family childcare programs. And it's all this bright stuff. It's all these projects. And I thought that actually does not capture childhood at all. So I thought if I were to think about, like I'm trying to do in my book, childhood as a culture and to think about childhood the way an anthropologist would think about childhood, looking at the artistic products of childhood the way adults understand them, we might actually miss something really important about childhood.
And so I think in some environments, I just think that's so interesting because in some environments you may see some of those indicators. Some of the children do love the bright colors. So what would you? And I guess what I'm taking from what you're saying and what you've written is that that sometimes there's too much uniformity that's not child-directed. It's just kind of glossed over. Their actual culture we're glossing over and kind of putting our preferences on them. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's been interesting because I talked about this in some of the earlier conversations that we had, but I'm currently living in Switzerland, and so my kids are growing up here in the schools here. And what's been interesting is the Swiss culture, to condense this down into a very small little bullet point, the Swiss culture really values rule following and uniformity, and that shows up in their artwork. So my kids come home with the most project crafty art things that you could imagine, and they get graded on them. So, if their children are asked to draw a tree, for example, and maybe they're in first grade, they're asked to draw a tree, and they draw the tree, they draw the leaves blue, they might get graded down on their tree because trees don't have blue leaves. So, I mean, depending on and this does not make the Swiss culture sound very good, which I don't intend to do, but I've noticed that they really value this uniformity and this rule following. And in the U.S., there's such a strong pushback against that kind of thing, that children need to have this process-oriented art that is not focused on an end product. If children are trying to, if you get 20 children lined up in a classroom and you try to direct the exact order of their artistic experience so that everybody ends up with a project that looks really cool, that looks the same, that's going to look nice hanging on the wall, that might not actually be what a child needs, or that might not be valuable within the culture of childhood as an expression of art. So what we value as adults in terms of artistic expression, we value the end product, but childhood experiences art in a very different way than that.
And you talk about that difference between the product and the process, which is talked about almost ad nauseum sometimes in the early childhood circles of process versus product. And I've personally come to believe that it's more of a spectrum, that you're not either it's a process, it's a product, but that some activities are more process oriented, some activities are more product oriented, and that we just need to be aware of what our intention is and how appropriate it is for those individual children that we're working with and how it meets what our intentions are. I think there can be some somewhat product oriented activities as long as we're aware of what that is and what our objective, our purpose for doing it, right. That we can create something that's somewhat more crafty, but because we're wanting them to practice, and more so as children get older, we may want them to practice a certain skill or concept in the context of creating something, but that we need to be aware that that's a craft, that's not process-oriented art.
Right. And I think in terms of naming and measuring what holds artistic value to children, I would say that the majority of product-oriented projects don't fit the cultural, it doesn't fit within the cultural framework of childhood as what holds artistic value. So for example, you think about what children do when they experience art. It is more of an experience than an actual process. I mean, one of my favorite things is to paint with toddlers. And, for toddlers, it's the experience of feeling the brush or mixing the colors or putting as much paint on the paper as possible so you end up with holes in the paper or observing the brush strokes going side to side or up and down. And as you sit with toddlers and experience this art, I mean, one of the little girls in my program used to just love to take her hands and smear the paint. When we were finished with the paint, just smear it all over the paper, and she could sit there for 10 or 15 minutes, just moving her hands kind of in circles, almost in a meditative state, just feeling and experiencing this sensation of the paint on her hands. I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a distinction. I think in some early childhood circles, we want to push process into every domain of the child's experience, which leaves a very unstructured program. And I think, for the most part, I would say the less adult driven, the better. But a program does have to have overall structure in order to provide a sense of safety and security and predictability and routine and all those kinds of things. So sometimes sometimes you do want to have something that's product oriented, like you want to, I'm trying to think about something off the top of my head, but maybe children want to build the tallest tower they possibly can. That is a product driven experience. Or they want to, see how far they can throw a balloon, for example. That might be another product. That's something that's driven on an end result. Mm-hmm. I think for the most part, artistic experiences, if, I think if they are geared towards a product, here's one thing I will say. There are some kids who get very frustrated because they want to draw a specific thing or they want to create an artistic representation of something. So I remember there was a time when my daughter was probably 4 or 5 years old and she was trying to draw a bear and she was beside herself because she could not draw the bear that she wanted to draw.
Right.
And in that case, it was helpful for us to print out pictures of bears and to look at what kind of component parts make up a bear. There's a circle for the head and the larger circle for the body, and there's 4 legs. But even in that, by printing off pictures, then she had something she was trying to aim for, which made her dissatisfied with what she was able to create. So I don't know, it's a double-edged sword, but I can see what you're saying, about some, that there definitely is a spectrum. It's not one way or the other.
Kind of an all or nothing. I feel like there are a lot of
yeah.
That way for discussion purposes, we kind of talk about them as one or the other, but in reality, there's kind of this spectrum, and we just have to be aware of where we are when we hit that.
Exactly.
When you talk about process-oriented art, I think it's so important. You use the word value frequently, and I think that's so important to recognize that what we value and what the children value are not always the same. And in fact, you have a quote I really liked. It's on page 127 for those who have their books out. It says, early childhood professionals are bound in a difficult way to conflicting interpretations of time. We work with a population who doesn't share our concern for products nor our attachment to the future, and yet these are the rubrics by which we and our stakeholders, the parents, fellow colleagues, administrators, and the surrounding community, measure our effectiveness. So we adults and stakeholders kind of value these artifacts to prove that we're being effective, but that's not what the children are valuing, and it's kind of creating this, I don't know, it's out of sync with each other. So
it's a tension. I mean, I think what's interesting about that, and so I understand this in kind of a convoluted way, but I understand this because I think about the way we understand time. For adults, time is a commodity. We think about how we spend our time, how we save our time, how we are we being effective with our time? Did we waste our time? If we go to the emergency room and we have to sit and wait for an hour, we think that's the worst waste of time in the world. And for children, it's not the same way. So part of our obsession and our attention to products is it's the way that we know that what we did was important. And so at the end of the day, if the parents show up to pick up children from their programs, for example, and we don't have anything to give them, we have a hard time justifying that we are worth the parents' time, that we are doing good work with their children if there's nothing to show for it. And so much of childhood doesn't have anything necessarily to show for it. The child who spends 15 minutes circling her hands in the paint does not have a pretty picture to take home at the end of the day. And sometimes that's a hard role for the teachers to navigate, for early childhood professionals to navigate, is knowing, how do I explain this to families, to my stakeholders, and still stay true to the cultural needs, to the needs of the children in my care? And one of the things that I think is important that you were bringing up with this quote here is how exactly we do straddle this line. So we spend all of our days with a population of people who is not future oriented like we are as adults, and so they don't have this connection to production and products and artifacts. And yet we are paid by and beholden to and responsible to people who are a part of our own cultural community where they value the products and the evidence to show that what we've done is important. And so I think there's an important role for communication here. And as early childhood professionals, we communicate about lots of things to help parents, to help families understand what it is that we do. And we need to be thoughtful and take some time in how we do that in relationship to art.
That's so true. And it's interesting when you talk about the difference. When you mention the child who spins her hands in the paint for 15 minutes, mm-hmm. and it's always interesting to me that sometimes you'll have those children who will spend so much time experiencing this thing that they're working on. And then at the end of the day, when you're trying to send home that artifact, they're completely disinterested or don't even recognize it as theirs because of the experience they valued. And that's not to say that they don't ever value what they make. There are times that's
of course
a prized possession, which you address as well, that children can value the product. It's just that they mm-hmm. don't have the same kind of quota mindset that we have to check the box. Like you said, that here's something I can send home to represent what we did today, because that doesn't always exist.
Exactly. Or what comes out of it doesn't look to the families like what they might expect of something mm-hmm. that took all this time and experience. I mean, I remember one moment I had this little girl who was working. She had I think it was a cardboard from the back of a cereal box. So it was about that weight of cardboard. And she spent the whole day lining up stickers across the top. The top corner had a bunch of stickers. And then she took markers and I think basically drew straight lines down from the stickers to the bottom of the cardboard and maybe put some other kinds of stickers, and then she cut fringes along the edge with scissors. I mean, when she got finished, this thing was a masterpiece, and she said, my mom is going to love it. I mean, she just knew my mom is going to be so excited to receive this, the back of a Cheerios box or whatever. With stickers and fringe and lines and everything. And she put it in her cubby to take home, and she went back and checked on that thing 5, 10, 20 times. I don't know how many times, but she went back and checked on that thing so many times because for her it represented this gift of love to her family, to her mother. And yet, by our adult standards, this does not represent a childhood masterpiece. I mean, this probably isn't one that's going to make it as the parents, after it hangs on the fridge for a while, after it maybe gets, maybe it gets photographed to put in the baby book later on, but it probably doesn't make it into that, into that portfolio that might stay with the child until they're grown up to be adults. It's probably not one of those kinds of masterpieces. Yet for her in that moment, this was something spectacular.
Right. I think one of my favorite comments that a parent made to me one time, and she was an artist herself, and she said, I love all the random art projects you do. And I thought that was such a funny way to term it, but it was right, because we did a lot more kind of process-oriented or, random pieces, loose parts that they could put together. And I think it was just something I mulled over for the longest time. Obviously, still, this is years from then, and I'm still thinking about it, that she saw the value in it, but I wondered, how do other parents see these random art projects, to see that they don't look like the cookie cutter cute project, but that the kids enjoyed the experience of it. So,
and I think we have a really important job to play. I kind of consider that our role as early childhood professionals is we are kind of the interpreters, because we belong to the culture of adulthood, but we are familiar with the culture of childhood. So we're not insiders with the culture of childhood, but we're closer to the culture of childhood than maybe most adults or the average adult because of what the work is that we do. And so we have a responsibility almost as an interpreter to help parents and help colleagues and help other professionals understand this is why we do what we do. So one of the things that I did when I ran my family childhood program was I had developed a very extensive statement of philosophy and purpose. And when I would have families come for interviews, I would spend some time talking them through, this is the way my program works. When you come to pick your child up, you might not end up with this, the masterpiece, the thing that looks oh so cute and you're excited to go home and hang it. You might get a cup full of cut paper, or you might get a cereal box with stickers on the back. I never know exactly what you're going to get, but know that the time that your child is spending here is worthwhile. And part of the way that we can help parents understand the experiences that the children are having in our care is something like photography. Taking a digital picture while the child is, while the little girl is spinning her hands in the paint, to be able to take a picture of that and just write it down. 4 or 5 sentences to say, this is what your child was doing today. I got to observe her incredible attention span as she sat there. I got to see her face, her eyes change as she saw the colors mixing. To have some thoughtful and, reflective sentences as kids get older, to have them dictate to you what they are experiencing, and you can capture that a little bit to share with families, because it is important as a way of building trust with the families that you work with, that you're helping them to understand from the perspective of their children, this is what life is like here when I get to come and experience and do art.
I love that perspective of our role as interpreters. I just think that's a great label to put on it. And I'm a big fan of taking photos to document the process. And it's great for those things that they are experiencing but not able to take home as an artifact. I had one boy he would spend so much time immersed in the block area and would do these amazing things that I would take pictures of just to be able to keep track of it. But I find that that's also really helpful for cleanup time when they're involved in something that they don't get to take home and they don't want to clean it up, that you can say, hey, let me take a picture and I'll make sure I send it to your mom or dad and you will have that forever. And then we can clean up the block area. Exactly.
Or then they can have it the next day to help them recreate and start over with where they were the day before.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned somewhere in the book, I don't have the quote right with me, but essentially that when we just pay attention to what they're immersing themselves in, what they value, it communicates value to them. So it's not always, here's your cute project that I'm going to put a gold star on and hang on my fridge. That's great too, whatever. But that we just show that we're interested, but we let them be the expert. And, I value it. I'm looking at it. I'm taking pictures of it and I'm asking you to tell me about it. That communicates so much value.
And I think this is a good moment to bring a little word of caution here, because I think one of the things that we struggle with the most in this day and age with technology the way it is divided attention. And children need to know that they have our full attention. So when they are sitting there and when they are swirling their hands in the paint, it might be tempting to pick up even the digital camera and do some documentation. But the documentation can't take away from the process of observing and interacting and appreciating and valuing what the child is doing right then. For a while, I kept journals for the kids in my program. When I started my program, it was very small. It was just two children, and it grew from there. So when the first 2 children started, I kept journals for them. But then my program grew to where I had 6, 7, 8 children that I was caring for. And I found that the demands of writing, for me, this was a daily journal. For writing this daily journal became such a distraction from what I was doing with the children that I had to really pare it back to where I did still keep notes and I did still take photos and I did still document the things that were happening, but I didn't document all the time. I think we run the risk of teaching children that the value in something is for how we can present it on a camera. Is it Instagram worthy? Not that that's a phrase that they'll know, but is this something that I can present and share to other people? Or is it something that I'm just appreciating in the moment where I am now? And for children, they are present oriented. And so they need people who are also going to be present oriented with them.
That's a really great point, that we have to balance that task of documenting and all of those things that teachers need to do, and balance that to make sure it's not taking too much from our presence and the work at hand in that moment. That's a really great reminder. There's one other thing before we move on to the other chapter that I want to talk about, and I know we talked about this previously, that it could jump into a much deeper concept, but I just loved the word that you used. So you mentioned, I think it's towards the end of chapter 5, that sometimes we as adults, when we're talking about children's artistic expression and their projects and the process that they engage in, that sometimes we adults commit acts of cultural appropriation, which can be a loaded word in this day and age, but it created such an interesting concept in my own mind. I hope that I didn't give it a different meaning than you intended, but I found it so interesting in the context, like we've talked about, that sometimes we as adults get so caught up in the product to the extent that we kind of own the product and just bring the kids along for the ride. Can you explain a little bit about your perspective of, as we talk about childhood as a culture, that sometimes with their art we commit cultural appropriation?
Absolutely. I mean, this can touch into a very large conversation, but I think, to distill it down, cultural appropriation would be dominant cultures benefiting from the products or the different effects of a non-dominant culture. So adults benefiting in some way, or using for their own purpose the products that children are creating. So I would be, using the children's art in order to make me look like this great teacher or make me look like this great professional. Sometimes this looks like adults coming along and actually altering the work of young children. So saying like, oh no, the person here is supposed to have, I don't know, a circle for a head and you drew it as a triangle, you must change it, or cutting something out for them, or doing the project for them in order to make sure that the project looked right. I'm reading this interesting book right now. It's called Far and Away, and it's a compilation of essays written by a writer who I just love. His name is Andrew Solomon, and it's a book about travel, and he was a travel writer for many years, and so it's a collection of some of his essays that document his travel around the world. And his first several essays, they're ordered in the book chronologically. So the first several essays take place in the late 80s and early 90s in Russia and in China and in South Africa. And all of these countries were going through massive shifts. The USSR falling, or the end of apartheid, or the massacre in Tiananmen Square. And all of these things were happening, and the artistic communities were having a very major shift in the way they expressed their art. And what happened in a lot of these cases in both Russia and China is that Westerners came in and started buying up art. So Westerners would come in and buy Soviet art, or Westerners would come and buy Chinese art. And what was interesting is the artists always said they couldn't get it. These outsiders didn't understand what we were doing because our art was rooted in a culture, and the art was political because it was making this statement. But once you removed it from the culture and appropriated it, took it back to the Western context, it didn't make sense anymore. It was disconnected from its meaning. And so for childhood, I think that's really an interesting thing to ponder, because for children, art is this process. It's this experience. And when we take it out of that cultural context and we force that experience into a product mold that we have designed as adults that changes the experience of children, we alter it and we use it for our own benefits in a way that I think does not benefit children. So again, kind of a long answer, but I think it's really important to look at there is relevancy. There's relevancy to artistic expression within a culture. And unless you understand it from the inside, you totally miss the point.
I think that's a really powerful concept to ponder. Like you said, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Are we letting them experience art, or are we trying to use their art for our objectives, for our own gain?
Right.
Like you said, to make us look good. I know I have a friend who said one of her worst experiences working in early childhood environments, she was asked by a lead teacher, they'd done an art project, and then a lead teacher asked her to go to the back and fix them all before they send them home, so that they, move the eyes more to the center of the faces, or, that, like you said, is probably your worst case scenario. But there are other times when even just our intention is different, that my intention is that I have this great thing to send home, not my intention is for you to have a great experience. And just keeping that in check is so important.
Yep, absolutely.
Shifting just a little bit into chapter 6, and I just love the cultural perspective that you put on this book. And in this chapter, you talk about the economics of belonging. So for childhood, that the concept of childhood as a culture, the system of economics is belonging and that their currency is attention and the connection, like you talked about before, the importance of giving attention. Why do you think attention and connection and a feeling of belonging are part of the economics? What made you put those together? I think it's so fascinating. Yeah.
So I have to be honest, this was the last chapter I wrote, and it was the hardest chapter to write. And I read a lot, and I thought a lot, and I had these massive flow charts, with Post-it notes all over my office as I was trying to pull this chapter out of my head. And in the end, I was so pleased with how it came out, because I think I really did kind of put the spin on childhood that I think is helpful and meaningful to think about as we think about children. So one of the things, I had to start by asking the question, what is a system of economics at its pure basic level? I'm not an economist. That would be very far outside of my field of expertise. So I had to even start there. Is what are economics and what is a system of economics for? And at the heart, a system of economics describes value and the way we have product, the way we manage products and services. And so for children, that's going to look a little bit different, but honing in on that idea of value, what holds value, is how I kind of got to this idea of belonging and connection and attention. So in my research, I came across a researcher. Her name is Alison Pugh, and she, I think she's in the UK. Anyways, she writes a lot about consumer culture and childhood, and she has this phrase that she talks a lot about the economics of belonging, and the way it relates to childhood. And as she wrote, I was like, yes, I get it. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. So, adults know they're valuable because of the things that they do. For people who are earning money in the workforce, I know that I'm valuable because of how much I get paid. Or I know that I'm valuable because if I'm a work-at-home parent, I know that I'm valuable because I get X number of loads of laundry done at the end of the day. At some level in the economics of adulthood, that's really how we express value. And for children, it's different. For children, they know that they're valuable the extent to which they feel like they belong. So how much do I belong to my family? How much do I belong to my peer culture? How much do I belong to my school community? And the way that I know if I belong or not is I have attention from the people who are important to me. I have attention from my peers in peer culture, or I have attention from my parents or the other important adults in my life. And that's how I know that I belong. That's how I gauge my level of belonging. Whereas, in adulthood, in the culture of adulthood, I could gauge my level of worth based on, let's just say how much I got paid for something. If I did a job and I got paid for it, I would know that job was valuable, for example.
I think that's so interesting to think of that. Like you said, it's what they value. And I think that could be said for adults as well, that we value our sense of belonging. It's not to say that they're exclusive, but
right.
That for children, that is where they hold the most value. And so with that context, with that perspective, how do you think we could be doing a better job, we as parents and teachers and caregivers, in giving our children a rich supply of that attention and connection? What are some things that you think we could be doing a better job of?
Well, I get stuck. When I think about the way that adults talk about childhood behavior. And we talk about a lot of behaviors as attention-seeking behaviors. We even talk about it when we talk about infancy, right? That if a child cries and you pick them up, you're going to spoil them, or you're going to teach them, you're just going to teach them to keep crying. If you want them to stop crying, you need to not give them attention. So the way that we tend to talk about behavior and teaching children to behave is in terms of giving or what's what I'm looking for? Giving or, I'm blanking. Giving or withholding, that's the word. Giving or withholding attention as a way of teaching children to behave. And I think we need to just kind of disconnect those ideas in our mind, because if a child is asking for attention or they're asking for connection, it's because they need attention and they need connection. There was some blog article floating around this week that said why you should always give your children attention if they're asking for it, something to that effect. And I think it's true. If a child is asking for attention, we need to give it. So there's a difference between indulging the attention-seeking behavior and responding to the attention-seeking behavior. So I think we need to do a better job of teaching children how to ask for our attention. For example, at the end of the day, when families would come to pick up the children, oftentimes that's when I would see the strongest behavior because children are wondering, who do I belong to now? Do I belong to Emily, or do I belong to my family, or how do I know that I'm important in each of these contexts? And so they would often act very strongly because they were trying to have that reassurance from attention from somebody that they mattered or that they were important. So I do little things. I mean, parents can do little things like holding the child's hand. If a child is my youngest son right now, he's 6. He'll come up while I'm in the middle of a conversation with somebody else and just start talking to me in the middle of my conversation. Right. And instead of telling him, first of all, I don't like to break the conversation that I'm in, but instead of saying, stop interrupting, you can't interrupt me, you can't do that, then I'll take his hand. I'll hold his hand. And when I hold his hand and I squeeze his hand, he knows he still has a connection to me. He knows he's still loved. And then as soon as there's a break in the conversation, I can turn my attention to him and respond to him. So physical contact, maintaining that close contact, talking about those things outside of the moment of intensity. So I can tell him later, son, when I'm in a conversation with somebody else, I can't stop that conversation to talk to you. But if you need my attention, just come and tap on my leg and I'll take your hand, and you can know that I know you're here and that I'm ready to talk to you as soon as I can. I think smartphones, I think technology are the worst at dividing our attention. So we're not giving our full attention to children. I think putting our phones away is a really important act of giving attention to children. I think sitting with children in the same space, not even necessarily acting along with them or playing along with them, but just sitting there and watching what they're doing, is a good sign that we're giving them attention and connection. I think the more we can separate this holdover that we have from an antiquated parenting age that says we need to withhold attention when children are misbehaving, I think that's better.
I think that's a great point. And this may be an unfair question because it's a big one, and maybe it's a personally selfish question. But I feel like as a professional, as a teacher, I'm really good at being 100% present because that's my job. That's what I'm doing. Yeah. That's what I'm doing in the classroom. As a parent, I find that much more difficult because, like you mentioned, it's a really great point that we have to be aware that all this multitasking is dividing our attention, and our kids need our attention. That's their currency, right?
Right.
But in real life, as a parent, you can't be 100% giving your attention 100% of the time unless you have a household staff that is taking care of every other aspect of your life, right? So do you have some wise words to share on as a parent, I don't know how you find that balance, right?
I don't know if I have such wise words to share with you, but I can reflect a little bit on the things that I've tried to do, not necessarily effectively, but I think there's some really important points to be made here that, I hesitate to say, you give children your attention 100% of the time. I think that's not actually a goal that we want to aim for, but that for those periods when they have our attention shouldn't be divided. So if the child says, hey mom, come play a game, let's play Uno together, then I'm playing Uno and I'm not also updating my Facebook status at the same time. And I'm not also Instagramming the game at the same time and saying to everybody else, hey, look at how fun this is that we're playing Uno. And I'm not getting on FaceTime with my relatives who are far away and saying, hey, look, we're playing Uno. And then it's important to be fair with children to say, I can't give you my 100% attention right now. I'm doing something else. So now is the time for you to go play in your bedroom, and it's time for me to read a book or prepare dinner or do some laundry I think it's fair and it's important for children to have those times when they aren't receiving our 100% attention also. And if they've had times when they have been with us and have been receiving good quality attention, they won't need it 100% of the time. They're going to enjoy playing with their siblings or playing by themselves. And the times that they keep coming back to ask for more attention, that should be a signal to us as parents that somehow the attention that they're getting from me doesn't feel like 100% undivided attention. So, yeah.
That's a really good point. You did a great job. Those were wise words. That was great.
It doesn't always play out in my house, so.
Right. Sometimes it's easier to talk about these things.
Exactly.
And it takes a lot more time and effort to get them in line, right? It reminds me of a friend, told me something that I've tried to use as like kind of a guiding mantra, I guess, in a way. She says, I try to get my kids to understand that they are the most important people to me in the whole world, but they are not the only people in my whole world, you know, and it's just finding that balance that they get enough 100% attention, you know, I should say 100% focused attention to fill the bucket or feed their account if you're talking about economics.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But that they don't need it constantly all the time. They just need enough of it. And that I just think that's a great reminder that if we are trying to make that deposit, that we need to be focused and not multitasking in that moment. That there are other moments where we will, but if our intention of that moment is to feed the bank account of attention and belonging and connection, then we need to be without distraction. That's a really good point. Just to differentiate those parts of our day, know what our intention is in that moment. It's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you use the word purchase when we're talking about this economics framework, that children purchase a sense of belonging at times. So what are some of the ways that children try to purchase belonging?
Oh, I think it's great. I love watching this. So if you think about purchasing belonging, again, you're not purchasing it with currency, with dollars and cents, but you're purchasing it with the kinds of things that you know, or the kinds of movies you're interested in. I mean, it's like a bunch of kids getting together and talking about who their favorite Disney princess is, or a bunch of children getting together and talking about how fast they can run, or the different things that they have access to, knowledge of, or experiences with. And as they compare those things, they are having a voice in the conversation. They know that they're valuable. One of the great things that this researcher I talked about earlier, Allison Pooh talks about, is she said something about invisibility is akin to not having anything to say. So if you don't have anything to offer into the conversation, it's like you're invisible. So for example, when my children were first growing up, we didn't have a television, and I felt very strongly about the decision not to have our children watch TV. I thought there were lots of other more important things that they could be doing with their time. As an early childhood educator, I knew that television was the root of all evil. You know, I got up on a soapbox a lot about TV and about how children shouldn't be watching television. And I stand by a lot of what I said then. However, I've changed my perspective a little bit. And here's what I mean. When we moved to Switzerland and my children started school, one of the things that they experienced was that they did not speak the language of their peers. They couldn't speak any French. And when they started off going to school, one of the things that they could compare and they could have in common were things like movies. You know, even though the kids here didn't speak English, they could still sing the songs from Frozen. And they still had the backpacks and the gear, and I don't know what that says about our culture, except that those tokens, that knowledge, allowed my children to kind of purchase. That's a hard word because it sounds, I don't know. It
over commercialized.
It sounds overly commercialized and consumerist, but it allowed them to purchase some belonging. It allowed them to have an in with their friends. It allowed them to speak some common language. Another thing, for example, that was very popular when we first moved here were marbles. I don't know why they were so popular, but a couple years ago, my oldest daughter, she was 7 at the time, all of her friends were bringing marbles to school. And I just thought that, again, this is the strangest thing. I have no idea about this, but she's like, Mom, I wish I had some marbles because everybody else has marbles. And in my mind, I was like, well, I think I could make that work.
Right. I think
we could track down some marbles. And again, for me as her parent, watching her try to navigate this sense of being a total outsider, these were things that gave her a little bit of belonging. And so in a in a context that's not quite as not quite the same as mine. Thinking about early childhood settings. So, in my early childhood program, there was an experience I had where there were two children. One was running up ahead of the other. One was 4 years old. In the book, I named him Brian, and then in the back there was little Esther, who was 2. And Brian was running ahead, and Brian was saying, "You can't catch me," kind of like parents would do with their kids. "You can't catch me." And Esther was running along behind him, laughing and having a great time. And it was clear that this actually wasn't a game of speed. Because if it was a game of speed, Brian would have been way up ahead of Esther. As a 4-year-old, he would have beaten her roundly. But that wasn't the point of the game. Later on, Brian actually told me something. I said to him, "It looked like you and Esther were having a very fun time playing together. I could tell. I watched her smiling, and I could tell that she was really having fun." And he said, "Yeah, it was great." He said, "I knew that I couldn't run as fast as I really can run, because if I ran as fast as I really could run, then she wouldn't want to play with me anymore." And I thought that was so insightful for a 4-year-old.
I love
said,
that.
"You're exactly right." If you ran at your fullest speed, she wouldn't play with you anymore. So he was purchasing belonging. He was purchasing a space with her, which is to say a space of equality and not trying to get ahead. It's just a place in the circle, not being at the head of the line, where he wants to play with her, and he knows that if he runs as fast as possible, she's not going to have any space to play with him.
So it's about shared experience and also empathy, really.
Oh, 100%. 100%. And I mean, you see it with very little kids too. Little kids have this ability for that empathy with one another also. As they create these shared experiences, there was this wonderful story that I read, and a similar experience happened to me with babies who were pounding on a table, 14, 15-month-old babies. And they were pounding in a rhythm that created this game where every baby at the table was capable of participating. And they repeated the same kind of rhythm over and over and over. And as that rhythm began to get tired, one baby would add something new. They would start doing a little ah with their voice. And the other babies would join in. And so it was about creating this experience that was accessible to everybody. And you think about, we are not taught as a culture that babies who are 14, 15 months old have the capacity to empathize. But that is empathy right there, knowing that you want to create a shared experience and doing something that gives everybody access to what you're doing.
It's really a fascinating thing to me to, how kids learn to read other people, to look at their faces, or to take what they know about them and think about, how can I make this enjoyable for another person? I think that's something that, some children develop much earlier than others. Some adults are still working on it, right? Getting outside of themselves to see what other people need. But it's such an amazing life skill for all people to develop, to see beyond themselves, what can I do to help other people enjoy our shared experience? And that is how children develop belonging. I just think it's so fascinating to watch it play out in the simple ways in early childhood that they begin doing that. It's so fascinating.
And if you know what you're seeing, I just think it's so powerful. If you know what you're seeing, then you can appreciate it for what it is.
So as we continue talking about economics, which you and I are obviously experts in economics, right?
Of course.
Absolutely. But just like in the markets, how they have their scarcity in the markets, you say in your book that in the economics of childhood, the scarcity comes in the form of separation from loved ones. And that children struggle with separation so much because it threatens that sense of belonging that we've talked about. So what are some of the mistakes that we are making as adults when we're trying so hard to help young children who are struggling with separating? What can we be doing better instead of, some of these commonly used tools that are maybe not so helpful? Yes.
I think there's this could be a whole podcast on its own. The art of helping children through moments of separation. I think there's a few things. First of all, I know that times of separating are very hard on parents. When you drop your child off, for example, at daycare, and that child is screaming for you, and you close the door and walk away, that's a really hard thing to do. So I think, again, this is a moment for us as interpreters to come in and help parents understand, help families understand what's going on, help them know what happens as they've left. But some of the things that I think are really important is we tend to try to help children. We think we're helping by distracting children from their strong emotional experience. And I think we're doing some disservice. So what often happens is a child will get left, they're left at daycare, and the teacher says, "Oh, come over here, little Janie. Come over here and let's play with this monkey. Have you seen the monkey? Oh, look at the monkey. He's making such big, bright noises." And we get this big inflated voice, and we do whatever we can to try to distract so that she stops crying. That tends to be the end goal that we have, and we think a child who isn't crying is a child who is happy and well adjusted, and I think that's not always the case. Instead, I think there's a few tricks, tips, ideas, strategies, whatever, that would help. Number one, I think it's really important for parents, for families to establish a consistent habit at drop-off time. So I think it's very important for families to drop the children off, and whatever the morning routine is, if you walk inside with the child, if you take off the shoes with the child, if you walk all the way to the breakfast table, whatever the morning routine is, you do that routine, and then you say to the child, "I'm going to leave now. I love you. I will come back later," or, your babysitter's going to pick you up later, or your grandma's going to pick you up later, but we make a comment about what's happening later, and then we say goodbye and we close the door and we leave. Parents often, then they come back or they want to linger, and I think it's really hard for the child if there's not a clean moment of separation. So first thing is that clean moment of separation.
And I think,
second,
sorry,
go ahead.
Don't mean to interrupt, but I think as you mentioned that, I'm thinking how important it is, and I think you mentioned this in the book as well, how important it is to make sure that routine is communicated again with your caregiver or your teacher, whoever it is you're leaving them with. I know for me, one of my children who struggled most with separation in the preschool years, and I knew it was going to happen, and so I contacted his preschool teacher ahead of the first day of preschool and said, "Here's what I think is going to happen when I try to make that clean separation of my normal routine of drop-off. He is going to fall apart and scream and cry." And I didn't want her and I to look at each other with this panicked look and be like, "You want to take him? Should I take him? What should we do in this situation?" I don't think that's helpful. And so we made a plan between ourselves ahead of time to say, I said, "Here's what my routine's going to be when I hit my mark and I'm going to leave, and he falls apart. I need you to be the one that scoops him up and comforts and moves along to the next steps that you're about to get to, because I need to be consistent in leaving." And I think it's helpful. I so believe in what you're saying, having a consistent routine so the child knows what to expect. It takes away that anxiety, that guessing game, but also make sure you communicate that plan so that you aren't guessing whose role, when do we pass the torch of comforting and caring for the child when that situation is hard. I think it's really important to clearly communicate that to the caregiver so that they
That's
can
so wise. Yes. That's so important. That is so, so important. I think the other thing that I would say is it's important to not think of the moment of separation as this black and white moment. I think there's ways that we can help children carry families with them through the day. So, for me, right now my husband's away on a trip, and while he's gone, I have pictures of him. I can text him if I want to. We can Skype, we can video chat. We have ways to stay connected. Children, we often expect that they're going to say goodbye to their families and not have any connection or contact with their families till the end of the day. One of the things that I found was very powerful were photographs. And I would tell the families to bring on the first day, to bring photographs of the child's important things. So parents, relatives, important spaces at home, the child's bed, the child's high chair, the child's dog, the things, a picture from the outside of the house, a picture of the child with the parents. And what I would find, I had, in one particular moment, I had a child who was struggling with some difficulty with separation. And she would come in, we would make the break from the family, and let me finish this train of thought, and then I need to talk more about what happens at that moment of separation. But she would carry that picture of her dad with her through most of the day. So she would bring her dad with her to breakfast. She would put a picture of him next to her while she sat at breakfast. She would go get some of the play food from the dramatic play area, and she'd set it up so that he could have breakfast. And then when it was time for her to go play with blocks, she'd take him with her to go play with blocks, and then she'd take him with her when she would do other things.
Sweet.
It was very sweet. And, sometimes when children were having a difficult time, I would say, would you like to write a letter to your parents to tell them how you're feeling? And they would say yes. And so I would have them dictate these letters to me. And they were so sad. Daddy, I miss you so, so much. I wish you were here. I'm so sad. I'm crying all the morning for you. These very sad letters. And I would write down what they wrote. And again, that might require a little interpretation between me and the families so that the families would be able to put that letter into context. But helping children do some of the same things with their families that we do when we're coping with being away from the ones that we love. But also, so that would be a second point. So first thing is to, make a clean separation, like you said, to have a really good plan for how that separation is going to go, to help children stay connected. That's a really important thing to do. But I would also say at that moment of separation, this is one thing that is really tricky in early childhood spaces. That morning drop-off time is a really busy time of day. There's lots happening. So the more that we can do as early childhood providers to simplify that time, we should not be starting any big projects during that time. We shouldn't be, as much as possible, planning any big trips where we all have to leave right away first thing in the morning. We should try to do what we can to strategize if we serve breakfast in our programs for ways to make the breakfast process more independent for the children so that we can be available. Because what's really important is that when the children arrive, that we are able to sit with them while they're sad. So one of the phrases that I used to say was, I can tell you really miss your mommy and daddy, or you really miss, whoever it was that dropped you off. Would you like me to sit with you while you're sad? So for one thing, I wasn't imposing anything on them, and I was just giving them space. It's okay to be sad. I'm going to sit right here next to you. If it would make you feel good, you can come and sit in my lap. And oftentimes the other children would gather around. Again, this pulls on this idea of empathy. One child crying is recognizable to every other child in that program, and the children would come around, and I would say, oh, it looks like your friend Sam is feeling really sad this morning. I think Sam's sad because her mommy left. I know that sometimes I'm sad when my special people leave. And then I'd have another child pop up and say, I'm sad too when my daddy leaves. I'm sad too when my grandma leaves. So we could connect from this moment. And I would say for me, sometimes what helps is it helps to have a picture of the people that I love. And without a hesitation, one child from the program would run and go get Sam's family pictures and bring them over and say, Sam, do you want your family pictures? And somebody else would run and would go get a soft toy or a soft blanket or something. And would this help you? Would this be helpful? And as a community, we would surround the child who was sad and we would be there to support them. It identifies that the feelings are okay. They're valuable. As an adult, I miss people that I'm away from. B, it affirms that that child has a place in the community at school, just like they have a place in the community at home. Third, it shows that the connection with the family is still important. Instead of trying to distract from those emotions so quickly, it shows that really is still an important thing. So, I think I've kind of hit on all the facets of this separation piece, but I think it really is an important thing that we do to help ease the transition between families and care.
I love that description that you give, and I think it really points out that there's, again, as we talk about these fictitious black and white choices, that it's not this choice between either we gloss over their feelings and, don't teach them about how to deal with their emotions, or the other option is to wallow in sadness and cause everyone, to just sit there and wallow in it all day long. That it's, in reality, it's acknowledging it, and like you said, I love how you said that. Would you like me to sit with you while you feel that? And then, like you said, bringing the community together to think about what could we do, how could we help, and what might help you, and how that builds real empathy and real coping skills, rather than masking over it or communicating that you shouldn't have feelings, or communicating that you shouldn't express your feelings to me because I don't want to hear about it, but that we can find that healthy, happy middle ground of feel the feelings and find healthy ways to cope with those feelings.
Yes. I mean, one of my dear friends told me a story about Kara, about an experience that she had one time. And she talked about how, one of the children in her program, had an extremely rough, family background, with lots and lots of transition. And he didn't have enough experience in his life so that he knew with confidence that he would be picked up every day, that he would be, that he didn't have a very strong sense of connection and belonging. And when he first began in her program, I think he had a lot of difficulty in the program. And she ended up kind of stepping several steps back with this little kid and said, and helping him specifically with those moments of transition. And for a while, she would tell him, would you like to sit by the window and watch for your mom to come back? And he would sit by that window for most of the day. And it took him it didn't last forever, but it took a while before he had the confidence to know that his special person was going to come, and he could trust that enough to leave the window. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we need to remember. Kids don't have a whole lot of experience with this separation and return, and they need to trust that their special people are going to come back for them. And we can't rush that process. They have to be able to experience that and to feel like that moment of anxiety, that sense of concern is valued.
And they need to experience that consistency, as well as, like you said, they need to experience that we will value them while they're with us. I think that's a great comparison with both of those being incled. Well, Emily, thank you so much. I have loved these 2 chapters. I think I just love the connections that you draw from them. We have a little bit of time between this and our final installment, and we want to make sure that people are aware that the concluding chapter, chapter 7, we will also be doing question and answers from readers. So if people would like to pose their own questions to Emily about her book, or thoughts that you had as you read or listened to our discussions, make sure that you go to my blog at notjustcute.com and click on the contact spot up in the header, and in your subject field of that form where you can fill out, give me your question, and in the subject header, just put podcast Q&A or Emily Q&A, something that will identify it, so I make sure that I don't miss that one. But we would love to hear what questions you have had as you have listened, as you have read, and Emily would love to field them, right, Emily?
I would.
And share that with us. So we'll have a little bit of time. We're hoping in probably the middle of August or beginning of August, you'll be hearing the final installment of our read-along. It's been such a pleasure, Emily, and I'm excited to hear what questions people have for you.
Thank you. I'm super excited too. So yes, give me your most difficult questions, and I'll see what I can do.
Right. Emily, thank you so much for joining me, and enjoy. You have some travels coming up, and then we will get together soon after that.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot, Amanda. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 12. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com, and follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Be sure to submit your thoughts and questions from Emily's read-along by clicking on the contact button at the top of notjustcute.com. We just might address your question in Emily's final read-along podcast episode. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.